A mother's funeral was about to begin, but her son's scream and a doctor's intuition revealed an incredible truth that had been snatched from the hands of death. It was a normal day. The doctor arrived early and accompanied the start of the cremation of a woman, but the cry of the son brought everything to a halt. And what happened next? The sun was still low, but it was already warming up a little in the clear sky. The crematorium parking lot had few occupied spaces. Andrew got out of the car slowly, adjusted his white coat, and took a deep breath before entering. He was in no hurry. He always arrived much earlier to take over from his colleagues calmly. The familiar smell of reheated coffee and disinfectant reached him as soon as he entered the door. Inside, the air was cold, as if it wanted to keep out any human warmth. He walked down the narrow hallway, hearing only the echo of his own footsteps. When he entered the preparation room, he saw the body on the steel stretcher, a woman with a serene face and brown hair. He walked down the narrow hallway, hearing only the echo of his own footsteps. As he entered the preparation room, he saw the body on the steel stretcher, a woman with a serene face, brown hair with gray strands falling to one side. Andrew approached, looked at the sheet that covered her up to her chest, and checked the documents on the clipboard: name, age, cause of death, cardiac arrest. The handwriting on the report was firm but impersonal, as always. "Good morning," said a low voice, almost swallowed by the silence. It was a young man standing near the door. He was in his 30s, wearing a wrinkled shirt and with deep dark circles under his eyes. He was holding a folder with both hands, as if it were a weight he couldn't let go. "Are you the ones?" asked Andrew, trying to break the ice. Matthew, her son, gestured with his chin toward the woman on the stretcher. For a moment, Andrew didn't know how to respond, so he just nodded and pointed to a chair, but Matthew preferred to remain standing. "I'm going to need you to sign here," said another doctor entering the room. He handed over the papers, but the young man was slow to react. He looked at his mother's name, written in black ink, and his eyes filled with tears. "It's strange," he murmured, trying to control his voice. "I never thought I'd have to sign this one day." Andrew nodded to the doctor and just watched the scene. There was. Matthew took a deep breath, ran his hand over his face, and signed his name with the pen. The sound of the tip scraping the paper seemed louder than it should have been. He returned the board and looked back at the body. "She looks like she's asleep," he said, swallowing hard. "I talked to her on the phone last night." She was laughing, and now his voice broke. The silence became tense, almost suffocating. In the background, the distant sound of the oven preheating could be heard. Andrew put a hand on Matthew's shoulder. He didn't say anything. Sometimes what you feel can't be put into words. Matthew stood there a little longer, as if wanting to keep that last image. Then he closed his eyes and whispered something that neither the doctor nor Andrew could hear. Only then did he take a step back, take a deep breath, and let the procedure continue. The hallway seemed longer when he came out, and the cold in the room became even more intense. The noise of the oven preparing filled the room. It was a dry, repetitive sound, like an old engine revving up. Two employees in gray coats moved quickly, adjusting buttons, checking gauges, opening and closing steel drawers. One of them, older, took a key from his pocket and slowly turned it in the main panel. The click that followed was the signal that everything was ready. Andrew was a few feet away, with the board still in his hand. He glanced once more at the certificate name, age, time of death. Everything was in order. The accompanying tests confirmed cardiac arrest, nothing out of the ordinary, and yet something inside him would not relax. His eyes returned to the woman on the stretcher. The sheet was folded up to her shoulders, revealing part of her chest. The cold light in the room made her skin look paler, but not completely. He moved a little closer, leaning forward as if looking for a detail. There was a slight, almost imperceptible tint to her cheeks. It wasn't the dull gray he was used to seeing. He lifted the sheet a little and looked at her fingernails. They didn't have the dull, purplish appearance. They were different. He blinked, trying to shake off that feeling. "Doctor, would you like to check something else?" asked one of the employees cynically, without stopping moving the controls. He didn't answer after a brief pause. Sorry, but inside he wasn't sure. Andrew knew he wasn't in charge of this procedure. He was only there to accompany as part of his role in the department. The doctor in charge had already signed everything. Interfering would be at the very least overstepping his role and unethical, and that could bring problems. Still, his eyes insisted on returning to her face. It was such a small detail, so easy to ignore, and yet it seemed to scream at him. "It's going to take a few more minutes to reach the temperature," said the older employee without looking up. "Do you want to wait outside for your turn?" "No, I'll stay here." The answer came out too firm, and he noticed it himself. The silence returned, broken only by the growing hum of the oven. The heat began to spread through the room, but Andrew felt a chill run up the back of his neck. He adjusted his robe, trying to hide it. The board was still in his hands. He looked at his son's signature, the time recorded, the official stamp. Everything said it was fine, but what he saw in front of him didn't match. The tube began to slide slowly. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed in the room. The body remained lying down, entering the dark mouth, illuminated by the growing fire. Andrew felt his stomach tighten. The heat from the oven was already reaching his face. He looked once more at the woman, that color on her skin, her nails. His instinct spoke louder than any protocol. His heart began to beat so fast that it felt like it wanted to jump out of his mouth, and then it came out without thinking. "Stop!" His voice exploded hoarsely, filled with urgency. "I need to confirm if she's dead. Something's very strange here." The sound burst off the cold walls and returned as a deafening echo. The employee pushing the stretcher stopped suddenly. The doctor in charge, who was a few steps behind, opened his eyes wide. "What do you mean?" he asked in a tone between disbelief and anger. "Andrew, you don't have authority to—" "I know," he interrupted, almost shouting again. "I know I'm not in charge, but something's not right. Please listen to me." The older employee let out a heavy sigh. "Doctor, the report is signed. The procedure is clear." "Procedure?" Andrew took a step forward, pointing at the body. "And if it's a mistake, what if she's implying that the entire team doesn't know what they're doing?" The doctor in charge stepped forward, his face red. "That's serious, Andrew." "Serious is—" Andrew stopped, trying to control his voice. "Serious is burning someone who may still be alive." The silence that followed was thick, as if the air had become heavier. The two employees looked at each other quickly, not knowing whether to push again or back away. "Give me 2 minutes." Andrew raised his hands as if pleading. 2 minutes, and if I'm wrong, you continue. But if I'm right." The sentence hung in the air without needing to be finished. The doctor in charge looked at him angrily, but there was something in Andrew's eyes that made him hesitate. His jaw muscles trembled. 2 minutes, he said finally, dryly. "And you take full responsibility." Andrew was already approaching before he heard the response. The heat from the oven hit his back, but he only saw the woman's face. The noise in the room seemed to disappear, as if everything was happening inside a tunnel. He reached out, feeling her skin cold, but not as cold as it should have been. Everyone seemed to be holding their breath at that moment. Andrew leaned forward slowly, as if every movement were measured. 2 fingers touched the cold skin of the woman's neck at that precise spot he knew so well. For a second, nothing, just the heavy silence broken by the hum of the oven and the distant sound of footsteps in the hallway. He almost withdrew his hand, but then he felt it. A touch, a tiny, timid heartbeat, as if it were coming from far away. His whole body froze. His eyes flew open, and the world seemed to shrink until it fit in that spot beneath his fingers. "My God," he whispered, almost without a voice. The second pulse came weak, slow, but alive. Andrew's heart raced. He raised his face suddenly, shouting with all the strength he had, "Get her out of here now!" The employees looked at each other, motionless, as if they hadn't understood. "Doctor, what did the first one say?" But Andrew didn't let him finish. "I said get her out of here," he shouted, his voice broken. "She's alive." The doctor in charge stepped forward in disbelief. "You can't be here. Sit down." Andrew took her hand and brought it forcefully to the woman's neck. "Feel." There was a moment of absolute silence. The other doctor stood frozen, his gaze lost. His hand trembled slightly on her skin. He stammered before taking a step back. "It's impossible." "Impossible or not, she's alive." Andrew was already pulling the stretcher back, away from the heat of the oven. The metal creaked under his hands. "We're wasting time arguing." The employees, who had been motionless, now ran around unlocking doors and clearing the way. One threw a tray on the floor, the metallic noise echoing off the walls. The hot smell of the oven mingled with the cold air coming in through the side door. The woman's face remained serene, but now Andrew saw her differently. She was no longer a body. She was someone breathing, fighting, though almost invisible to everyone else. He leaned his ear close to her mouth again, and a faint breath, so weak it seemed imaginary, brushed his skin. Andrew closed his eyes for a moment, feeling the weight of it. When he opened them, he spoke softly but firmly, looking at everyone. "She's not going to die here, today." The hallway became a racetrack. The wheels of the stretcher squeaked on the smooth floor as two employees pushed hard. Andrew walked alongside, one hand on the woman's shoulder, and the other holding the cell phone to his ear. "I need an ambulance now. It's urgent." His voice came out fast, almost without pause. "Municipal crematorium. A woman. Yes, she's breathing, but very weakly." On the other end of the line, the operator was talking, but he hardly registered the words. He looked at her face, feeling that every second was slipping away. It was then that at the end of the hallway he saw Matthew. He was sitting on a wooden bench, his head down, his hands covering his face. When he noticed the movement, he stood up suddenly. "What's going on?" His voice came out shaky, almost breathless. "What happened to my mother?" Andrew approached, still walking alongside the stretcher. "Matthew, her." The words stuck in his throat. "She's alive." The young man's eyes filled with tears instantly. He took 2 steps back, as if the floor had disappeared. "I knew it," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I knew it," he repeated, louder now, grabbing the handrail of the stretcher as if it were a lifeline. "I knew it." Tears streamed down his face, falling onto his mother's cold hand. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against hers, feeling the faint breath escaping from her lips. "Mom, it's me. Hang on." He spoke softly, as if any noise could break that fragile breath. Andrew kept his eyes fixed on the road ahead. The exit door seemed too far away. Outside, the distant sound of a siren began to grow. He knew that every second now could be the difference between life and death. "Matthew, keep her head slightly to the side," he said, controlling his tone so his desperation wouldn't show. The young man obeyed immediately, one hand stroking his mother's hair and the other holding hers tightly. "Don't leave me. Please don't leave me," she repeated like a mantra. When they crossed the front door, the hot air from the oven was replaced by the cold. The siren was already close. Andrew took his first deep breath since the scream, but he didn't relax. Not yet. Her body was still there, fragile, breathing so little that it seemed to disappear with each pause. And yet, that fraction of life was all that mattered. The ambulance's beep made the stretcher shake a little. The continuous sound of the siren filled the air, mixed with the muffled hum of the engine. Andrew sat next to Lucille, monitoring her breathing, which remained short and irregular. An oximeter on her finger flashed slowly. Matthew sat in the seat in front of her with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped together. He stared at the floor, as if he were afraid to look at anything around him. "Matthew," Andrew's voice came out low but firm. "I want you to tell me the truth. Did your mother have any health problems? Anything with her heart?" The young man was slow to react. He blinked slowly and replied, "No. She was healthy, and then almost automatically she always was." Andrew leaned forward slightly, studying every detail of his face. No history of fainting, low blood pressure, arrhythmia, nothing, he repeated, but his voice faltered at the end. There was a tense silence. The doctor noticed that Matthew wasn't looking up. His hands were moving non-stop, squeezing and releasing a wedding ring on his finger. "You know, I've been doing this for many years," Andrew said, still calm, but with weight in his words. "When someone answers me by looking at the floor, they're usually not telling me everything." Matthew took a deep breath, as if he were going to speak, but he bit his lip and remained silent. Matthew insisted, Andrew this time in a firmer tone, "If there's anything I need to know to save your mother, you have to tell me now." The young man looked up for a moment. There were tears in his eyes, but also something that looked like fear. "I started to say, then looked away again. I already told you. She was healthy." The doctor leaned back in his seat, but didn't take his eyes off him. Something wasn't right. The answers came quickly, too automatically, as if they had been rehearsed. And that constant averting of his gaze burned like a clue he couldn't ignore. The siren continued to wail through the city, but to Andrew the sound was now mixed with an uncomfortable feeling. There was more to that story than Matthew was willing to tell, and he knew that sooner or later, the truth would have to come out. The emergency room was lit by a bright, almost cruel white light. The sound of heart monitors marked the time, along with the hurried comings and goings of the medical team. Lucille was lying on the stretcher with oxygen and an IV connected to her arm. Her face was still pale, but now there was a little color in her cheeks. Andrew watched closely as a nurse adjusted her gown to put the electrodes on her. It was at that moment that something caught his attention. Between the fabric of the brassiere and her skin, there was a discreet metallic glint. He frowned and leaned in a little closer. Carefully, he pulled the fabric aside. It was a small antique charm hanging from a thin chain. The metal was worn from time, but the figure was clear. St. Jude Thaddeus, the saint of impossible causes. Andrew picked it up carefully, turned the metal over, and on the back, engraved in very small letters, were the initials RM. He stood still for a moment, feeling the weight of it in his hand. It didn't fit. The name on the documents was Lucille Morales, and according to Matthew, she had never been married. So whose initials were those? The nurse noticed that he was holding something. "Is it hers?" she asked distractedly as she wrote in the file. "I think so," Andrew replied, still looking at the metal, but inside he was growing more and more uncertain. The charm seemed more than just an object. The wear on the edges showed that it had been used for many years, perhaps even decades. It wasn't something someone would keep by chance. He closed his hand around the metal, feeling the cold metal against his skin. "St. Jude Thaddeus," he murmured to himself. "Impossible causes." He looked up at Lucille. She was breathing slowly, oblivious to everything, as if she were in a very distant place. Matthew was sitting on the bench in the hospital hallway, his elbows resting on his knees and his hands clenched together, as if he wanted to crush a thought. His face was marked by tears, but now he avoided looking at anyone who passed by. Andrew approached slowly, still clutching the medal in his hand. He sat down next to him, took a deep breath, and began. "Matthew, I need to understand something." The boy just shook his head a little, without looking at the doctor. "You told me your mom was healthy, but you didn't know anything about diabetes, high blood pressure, heart problems, nothing. How could you not know?" Matthew opened his mouth, closed it, swallowed. His eyes began to tremble, as if the words were stuck. He stammered, his voice broken. Andrew turned his body to face him. "Matthew." The boy sighed deeply, closed his eyes, and let it all out at once, quickly, like someone pulling off a Band-Aid. I'm not her biological son. The silence that followed was heavy. Andrew blinked slowly, taking in the confession. What do you mean, no? He asked in a low voice. She raised me since I was a child. Matthew's voice trembled. I don't even remember my real mom. All I know is that one day I was very young, and Lucille showed up. She treated me like her son. She gave me a home, food, love. I never wanted for anything. He rubbed his hands over his face as if he wanted to hide behind them. But she never talked about her past, never told me who my parents were, and I never asked. Andrew was silent for a few seconds, observing the boy. He didn't see any lies in him, but he did see an enormous weight, the kind that someone carries for years without noticing it. So what does this mean? He asked, slowly opening his hand to reveal the medal. Matthew looked at the pendant, and his expression broke. I've never seen this before, he said, almost in a whisper. I don't know who RM is. His eyes filled with tears again. I always thought I knew who she was, that she was just my mom. He paused for a long time. Now I realize that maybe I don't know anything. Andrew put the medal in his pocket without taking his eyes off him. Deep down, he felt that this story had layers that were still far from coming to light. The hospital administration room was silent. Only the low sound of a fan spinning slowly in the corner could be heard. On the desk, a pile of medical records awaited signature. Andrew leafed through each page carefully, his face serious, like someone looking for something without knowing exactly what it was, until he found it. Lucille's file. He began to review the information line by line, date, time, history, until he stopped at the death certificate. The pen in his hand remained suspended in the air. The document was signed by a doctor he knew only by sight, a substitute who had been covering shifts in the last few days, and the time recorded as the time of death didn't add up at all. According to the document, Lucille had been pronounced dead at 9:40 p.m., but the hospital admission records indicated that she arrived around 10:15 p.m. How could someone declare a person dead who hadn't even arrived? Andrew frowned, checking again to make sure he wasn't seeing things. But there was no mistake. The times were clear. This doesn't make sense, he muttered to himself, running his finger over the signature on the certificate. The door opened and a nurse entered with some papers. Doctor, do you need anything else for that patient's case? She asked distractedly. Yes, he replied, still staring at the paper. Do you know where I can find the doctor who signed this? Not today. He's not on duty. She shrugged. Come back next week. Andrew said nothing. He just closed the folder slowly, but without taking his eyes off the signature. There were two possibilities. A very serious mistake that could have cost someone their life, or something much more serious. He took a deep breath, put the document back in the folder, and felt a lump in his throat. With every detail he discovered, the feeling grew stronger. This story was far from being just an administrative error. The waiting room of the USCI was shrouded in a heavy silence, broken only by the distant sound of a television, the news, and the soft noise of the coffee machine. The air there always seemed the same, too cold, too still. Andrew entered, still carrying the file folder under his arm, his head filled with confusion about the certificate. His eyes scanned the room almost without meaning to, until they stopped. Leaning against a column near the restricted access door was a man Andrew didn't know. Dark suit, well-tied tie, polished shoes. He didn't look like any relative he had seen there before. Standing upright, hands crossed in front of him. But what caught his attention most was his fixed gaze, unblinking, directed at the EU door where Lucille was hospitalized. He didn't seem nervous, more vigilant. Andrew frowned and walked toward him. Good evening. Are you waiting for someone? The man looked away for a second, as if surprised that someone had spoken to him. No, I just started to say, he began, but his voice was too low to be heard clearly. The doctor took another step forward, maintaining a calm tone. Do you know the patient, Lucille Morales? The man's expression changed for an instant, an almost imperceptible flicker in his eyes, as if the name had some significance for him. But instead of answering, he adjusted his jacket and gave a polite half-smile. "Excuse me," and he started to walk away. "Wait, Andrew." He tried to follow him, quickening his pace. The man walked through the side door into the hallway leading to the parking lot. The sound of his footsteps echoed for a few seconds, then silence. When Andrew turned the corner, the hallway was empty. No sign of the dark suit, no car starting, nothing. He stood there staring at the exit door. He felt that this man wasn't there by chance. He wasn't visiting a patient. He wasn't an employee. He was another strange piece in this puzzle that only seemed to be getting more confusing. Andrew returned to the waiting room, but now, every time the ICU door opened, he waited almost involuntarily to see that stare again. The room was in semi-darkness, lit only by the soft light coming from the hallway. The VIP on the heart monitor sounded slow and steady, almost like a metronome marking the silence. Andrew was sitting next to the bed, leafing through some papers, but always with his attention focused on Lucille. That's when he noticed a slight movement, her fingers moving and brushing against the sheet. Then her eyelids fluttered and opened slowly, revealing cloudy, lost eyes. "Lucille." Andrew leaned forward and spoke softly. "Can you hear me?" She blinked several times as if trying to focus. She looked around with an expression of fear and confusion. Then suddenly, the voice came out weak, almost a whisper. "Where is he?" Andrew frowned. "Who? Lucille. Who is he?" But she didn't answer. Her gaze seemed to pierce the wall as if searching for something or someone who wasn't there. Her chest rose and fell faster. "Lucille, it's okay. You're safe." He tried to touch her arm, but the reaction was immediate. She clenched her hand so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Her lips moved, muttering something Andrew couldn't understand. "Lucille, tell me who he is." His voice now had an urgent tone, but still controlled. She slowly turned her face toward him, her eyes filled with tears, with a deep, almost childlike fear. She opened her mouth as if to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, a tremor ran through her entire body. The heart monitor beeped faster. Andrew called the nurse, but before she arrived, Lucille let go of the seer, closed her eyes, and fell back into unconsciousness. He stood by the bed, staring at the small medallion of St. Jude Thaddeus. He felt that whoever he was the key to understanding everything. But for now, all he had was silence and questions that kept growing. The clock struck almost midnight when Andrew entered silently into the small archive room of the hospital. The lights were dim, and the smell of old paper mixed with disinfectant filled the air. Marion, a trusted nurse and friend of many years, was already waiting for him, leaning on the table with a bundle of files in her hands. "You know that if anyone finds out I'm doing this, I'll lose my job, right?" she said with a tired half-smile. "And I probably will too," replied Andrew, closing the door behind him. "But we need to understand who this woman is." He placed the locket on the table. The chain was tangled, and the faint glow reflected the yellowish light. Marion turned the medallion over, reading it aloud. Matthew swears he's never seen it," Andrew explained, "and he says he doesn't know anything about her past." Marion frowned and began leafing through an old file cabinet that stood apart in the corner. The pages were yellowed, and each file had handwritten notes. "Do you think Armeda is a real name?" she asked without looking up from the papers. "I'm almost certain. If it were just devotion to the saint, it wouldn't have initials on the back. This is personal." A few minutes passed before Marion stopped, her eyes fixed on a page. She ran her finger over the name written there and looked up at him. "I found something, but not here in the hospital. It's a police record." Andrew leaned in, reading over her shoulder. "Rosa Maria Harris, 28 years old at the time, disappeared in New Orleans 27 years ago." Marion flipped through 2 more pages. "They never found the body. Case closed." The doctor felt a chill run down his spine. The black letters on that paper seemed to scream, Rosa Maria R.M. Marion closed the file carefully, as if that paper were too fragile. Andrew? If it's the same person, that means this woman is not Lucille Morales. He looked at the metal again, feeling that it weighed more in the palm of his hand. With each clue, the feeling that he was getting into something much bigger than he had imagined continued to grow. And deep down, he was beginning to understand that discovering the truth could change everything. Andrew left the file room with the printed sheet in his hands. The paper was still warm from the printer, the smell of fresh ink rising into the air. He walked quickly down the quiet hallway. Each step sounded as if the tension made the noise louder. Matthew was sitting in the waiting room, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees and his gaze fixed on the floor. He looked as if he had aged years in the last few hours. Matthew called Andrew, stopping in front of him. "I need you to see something." The boy slowly raised his face with a tired, almost distrustful look. "What is it?" Andrew handed him the paper. In the center, a worn black and white photo showed a younger woman with long hair and a determined look. Below was the name, Rosa Maria Harris. Matthew held the sheet with both hands. For a moment he stood still. Then his eyes began to open wider, and his breathing quickened. The voice failed him. He tried again. "That's her. Are you sure?" Andrew asked, although he already had the answer in his eyes. "She's the same woman who raised me." Matthew slowly ran his finger over the photo, as if touching the paper meant touching the past. "A little younger, but it's her." Silence filled the room for a few seconds. Only the distant sound of a cleaning cart passing through the hallway broke the moment. "Matthew, this woman disappeared in New Orleans 27 years ago," Andrew said, lowering his voice. "She was never officially found, and according to the records, her name was Rosa Maria, right? Lucille Morales." The boy closed his eyes, resting his forehead on his hand. So all these years, she lived with a name that wasn't hers. He left the sentence hanging in the air, but the unspoken question was clear. Why? When he looked back at the photo, Matthew looked smaller, like a lost child. "I thought I knew who she was," but now he swallowed hard, pressing the paper against his chest. "Now, I don't even know who I am in this story." Andrew didn't answer, just stood there looking at that mixture of love, surprise, and fear on the boy's face. He knew that from that moment on, the answers he was looking for were not going to be easy, and perhaps not even certain. Night had already fallen on the hospital parking lot. The bright lights cast yellowish patches on the asphalt, and the cold wind brought the smell of approaching rain. Andrew walked towards the car, the printed sheet still folded in his coat pocket. His head was burning with questions that seemed to have no answers. When he pressed the button to open the car door, he heard footsteps behind him. They weren't fast, but they had a steady, calculated weight to them. He turned slowly. The man in the dark suit was there, a few feet away, standing under the light of a street lamp, the same steady gaze he had seen in the waiting room. Dr. Torres. His voice was deep, with a marked accent. Andrew didn't answer right away, just narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" The man walked until he was a few steps away. He extended his hand in a formal gesture. "Colonel Ramirez." Andrew didn't move his hand. "And what does a colonel want with me?" Ramirez looked away for a second, as if checking that they were alone. Then he lowered his voice. "It's not you. It's the woman you call Lucille." Andrew felt his body tense up. "What about her?" The colonel took a deep breath before speaking. "She's a witness. One of the few survivors of an old crime. A very old crime." His voice had a weight that was not just formality. "There are people who would prefer that she never speak again." The doctor frowned. "You're saying her life is in danger?" Ramirez nodded slowly. "Yes, and not just a little. You saved her from dying, but you may have put her in another kind of death, slower and more certain." An uncomfortable silence settled. The wind moved the colonel's jacket, and the light from a distant car illuminated his face for an instant. I want you to understand, Doctor, Ramirez continued. If she wakes up and tells what she knows, very dangerous people will want to silence her forever, and anyone close to her will also have to disappear. Andrew crossed his arms. And you're here to protect her, or to make sure she keeps quiet? The colonel stared at him for a few seconds, but didn't respond right away. An enigmatic half-smile appeared at the corner of his lips. Let's just say that depends on what she decides to say. Without another word, he took 2 steps back and turned away, disappearing into the shadows of the parking lot. Andrew stood still, feeling the cold night air penetrate his robe. Deep down, he knew that from that moment on, saving Lucille would not be just a medical matter, but keeping her alive against forces he did not yet understand. And he couldn't leave her there alone. The hospital looked different when he returned. The lights in the ICU hallway flickered occasionally, and the air was filled with an unnatural silence. There were 2 police officers at the door to Lucille's room, supposedly to protect her, but Andrew had already learned to be wary. It was after midnight when Marion, who was on duty, came over quickly, her face pale. "Andrew," she said almost without a voice, "I saw someone in the back hallway." It wasn't anyone from the staff. He felt a chill in his stomach. He looked toward the door where the 2 police officers were talking distractedly. "Where, exactly?" he asked, already stepping outside. It was dark in the pediatric area, but I saw a shadow move quickly. Marion took a deep breath. I didn't get a good feeling about it. Andrew returned to the room. Matthew was sitting next to his mother, holding her hand. "Matthew, we have to get out of here now." "What?" He stood up, confused. "The police aren't protecting her." "I don't trust them," replied the doctor without hesitation. "If I'm right, she's safer with me than here." Without wasting any time, Andrew disconnected the portable IV and helped Matthew lift Lucille, who was still weak, supporting her on his shoulders. Marion ran ahead to open the side door leading to the rear parking lot. The hallway was empty, but the tension was so thick that any noise sounded too loud. When they were almost at the exit, a metallic noise sounded behind them. Andrew turned quickly, but saw no one. "Oh, keep moving," he said, pushing Matthew forward. They ran out the door and into the darkness toward a car that belonged to Marion. She handed him the keys with trembling hands. "Go," she said, looking around. "I'll cover you." The engine coughed twice before starting. Andrew sped away from the hospital without turning on his lights, getting lost in the empty streets until he reached an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of town. Inside, the smell of old wood and dust filled the air. They laid Lucille on a makeshift mattress. She was shaking, her eyes half closed, but she seemed conscious. Andrew knelt down next to her. "Lucille, we're safe for now, but I need to know who's looking for you." She took a deep breath, and her voice came out in a weak whisper, heavy with pain. "Night. A long time ago, almost 30 years ago." She closed her eyes for a moment, as if the images were coming back with too much force. "I saw everything. Massacre. The police killed everyone." Matthew stood motionless with her hand clenched in his. "I grabbed a child and managed to hide him." A tear ran down her cheek. "I fled, changed my name, never returned." "And the child?" Andrew asked in a low voice. Lucille looked at Matthew with tears in her eyes. "He was just a boy," she cut him. "I raised him as my own son to save my life, and not even his." Silence filled the cellar. Matthew was in shock, looking at her as if it were the first time he had seen the woman who raised him. Andrew felt the weight of that revelation fall on everyone, along with the certainty that now, more than ever, no one could know where they were. The early morning was still cold when Matthew, sitting in a corner of the cellar, raised his head suddenly. His gaze was lost, as if a memory had just flashed through his mind. "Andrew." His voice was low but urgent. "I remembered something." The doctor who was standing near the makeshift door came closer. "What?" "There's a box at my house. Matthew swallowed hard. A wooden box with a small padlock. My mom always kept it at the back of the closet, wrapped in an old rag. Andrew frowned. Have you seen what's inside? Never. He shook his head. Once when I was a teenager, I tried to open it, but she caught me in the act. I was so scared I was shaking. She just said, if I'm ever gone, burn that box without looking inside. Silence filled the basement. Andrew took a deep breath, feeling that this could be the missing piece he needed to understand everything. Then let's go get it. Matthew hesitated. What if it's dangerous? More dangerous than not knowing, isn't it? Andrew replied firmly. They left in an old car that the doctor had in the garage, avoiding the main streets. Matthew's house was dark and silent. They entered quickly, without turning on any lights, moving only by the dim light coming from the street. In the room, Matthew knelt in front of the closet and moved clothes and smaller boxes until he reached the back. There it was, a dark wooden box, the padlock still in place. He placed it on the bed and stared at it for a few seconds before saying, "Open it." Andrew took a small knife out of his pocket and forced the padlock until it broke with a dry click. When the lid opened, a smell of old paper and dust wafted out. There was a heavy brown envelope. Matthew took it out carefully. When he opened it, dozens of photographs fell onto the bed. They were yellowed images, some blurred, showing scenes of a rural place and people lying on the ground with dark stains on their bodies. Matthew's eyes widened, unable to touch the photos. My God. At the bottom of the envelope were folded papers, lists of names, dates, handwritten records, and on one of the sheets was the seal of the New Orleans police with notes describing containment action, a cold term for what the photos clearly showed to be a massacre. Andrew looked through the documents in silence, his face growing more and more serious. This, he said in a grave voice, this is proof. Real proof. Matthew was breathing fast, his hands shaking. She kept this for almost 30 years. The doctor looked at him. And now, Matthew, there is someone willing to kill to make this disappear. The distant sound of a car passing by on the street made them freeze for a moment. They both knew that from that moment on, that envelope was more than a memory. It was a sentence or an opportunity for justice. The street was quiet when Andrew and Matthew left the house. Each carried a part of what they had found. The brown envelope was tucked under Matthew's arm, wrapped in an old coat so as not to attract attention. They got into the car quickly, avoiding turning on the lights inside. Andrew turned the key, and the engine responded with a low rumble. As he shifted into first gear, Matthew looked attentively to the sides. I don't see anyone, he said, trying to sound calm, but the tension in his voice gave him away. They drove down the narrow street, passing dark houses and closed gates. That's when Andrew saw two headlights appear in the rearview mirror at the corner. A black car slowed down a little to confirm. The car did the same. We've got company, Andrew muttered. What do you mean, company? Matthew turned to look. When he saw it, his whole body tensed. It's the same car that was parked near the hospital the other day. Andrew didn't respond, accelerating and turning at the first left corner, entering an even narrower street. The black car turned right behind them. We're being followed, Matthew said, breathing faster. Hold on tight. Andrew slowed down before making a sharp right turn onto a steep street. The black car tried to follow, but almost skidded on the curve. The streets were a maze of alleys and passages. Andrew used every shortcut he knew, passing between houses, crossing small squares, making quick maneuvers. Matthew looked back at every turn until, for a moment, the headlights disappeared. I think we lost them, Andrew said, but his tone was not one of relief, but of alertness. He turned once more, entered a dead-end alley, and turned off the headlights. They stood still, listening only to the distant sound of an engine passing by. When the silence returned, Andrew exhaled slowly. They're not going to stop, Matthew said, looking at the envelope in his lap. "Those men want to kill my mom. They don't want anyone to know what happened." Andrew looked in the rearview mirror, as if he expected to see the headlights appear again. "And now, Matthew," he said slowly, "we know too much to back down." The weight of those words hung in the air, as heavy as the fear they felt, and they both understood that from now on, every move had to be calculated, because they weren't just running away, they were getting married. A light rain began to fall when Andrew parked the car in a dark corner of a narrow street in the old part of town. The sign, dimly lit, for a small neighborhood newsroom was barely visible in the gloom. He turned off the engine and looked at Matthew. "Stay here." He didn't say it as a request, but as an order. The fewer people who know, the better. Matthew clutched the envelope tightly, but nodded. Andrew got out, crossed the street to the cracked glass door, pushed it slowly, and went inside. The smell of damp paper and old coffee greeted him. In the back, a middle-aged man with gray hair and crooked glasses was slowly typing on a typewriter. "Emil Vargas," Andrew called out. The former police officer and journalist looked up in surprise. Torres took off his glasses and blinked as if to make sure it was really who he thought it was. "How long has it been?" "Years." Andrew approached, taking the envelope out of his coat and placing it on the table. "I need you to see this." Emil opened the package carefully. When he saw the first photos, his smile faded. He flipped through the pages quickly, looking at images and lists of names. He stopped at a document with a police letterhead and remained silent for a few seconds. "My God," he murmured. "Do you have any idea what you are bringing me?" "Yes." Andrew crossed his arm. "It's evidence of a massacre committed by corrupt police officers almost 30 years ago. The woman who survived is still alive, and now they want to kill her to cover it all up." Emil closed his eyes and let out a heavy sigh. "Andrew, this is going to stir up some very dangerous people. It's not just dirty politics. It's on another level. And if we don't move on this, she dies, and those victims will remain forgotten." The ex-cop looked at the photos once more, then slowly closed the envelope. "Give me a few hours. I'll see what I can do." But he paused, staring at Andrew. "Take good care of her." Andrew asked him to make copies and leave the original with him. The man agreed. The doctor nodded and returned to the car. The rain was now hitting the windshield harder. Matthew looked at him expectantly. "Are you going to do something? He said he needs time." Andrew started the engine, but we have to move fast. They didn't have time. A few hours later, back at the warehouse, Andrew woke up to the sound of wood breaking. The side door was kicked in and knocked down. 2 hooded men entered, armed and shouting orders. "Matthew, grab the box." Andrew pulled the boy by the arm, pushing him toward the back. Matthew grabbed the box with what was left of the evidence, and together they ran out the back door and into the rain. Behind them, they heard screams. When they turned around, they saw Lucille being dragged away by one of the men with his face covered, her arms struggling to break free. "Mom," said Matthew, trying to go back, but Andrew stopped him forcefully. "No. If you go back now, they'll kill us all." They hid in a nearby alley, gasping for breath, soaked, watching the kidnapper's car disappear into the night. Andrew closed his eyes for a moment, his heart racing. In that second, a certainty pierced his chest like a knife. Someone close to him had spoken, and now it was no longer just a matter of bringing the truth to light. It was a matter of saving Lucille before it was too late. His cell phone vibrated. It was early morning, and the sound seemed louder in the silence, broken only by the raindrops outside. Andrew looked at the screen, an unknown number. His heart raced even before he answered. Well, the voice on the other end was in no hurry. It was low, cold, as if every word was measured. "If you want to see her alive, hand over everything you have." Andrew was silent for a second, trying to recognize the tone, an accent, any clue. "Where is she? Aren't you the one asking the questions, Doctor?" The pause that followed was laden with menace. "You have 12 hours. After that, don't come back. I'll send you the address." The doctor pressed the cell phone to his ear. "And if I don't hand over anything, then it'll be your fault." The call ended with a sharp click. Andrew stood still, staring into nothingness. Matthew approached anxiously. "It was about my mom, wasn't it?" The doctor took a deep breath. "Yes, they want the tests." Matthew took a step forward indignantly. "Then hand them over. For God's sake, hand them over and save her." Andrew looked up. "Seriously? And if you give them to them and they kill her anyway, do you think those men are going to let a witness live?" Matthew fell silent, swallowing hard. The answer was in his eyes. The doctor then took his cell phone and dialed a number he knew well. "Captain Harris, this is Dr. Torres. I need your help. But before I say anything, tell me, are you alone?" "Yes, doctor." The policeman's voice sounded firm. "You can trust me." Andrew closed his eyes for a moment. Choosing who to trust now was more than important. It was a matter of life and death. "I have a delicate situation, and I need men who won't sell their souls for money." The captain didn't ask for details. "Tell me the place and the time. I'll take care of the rest." Andrew hung up and rested his hands on the table. "I sit down." The weight of the decision seemed to crush him. He had little time, invisible enemies, and a life at stake. He looked at Matthew, who was watching him silently. "We're going to try to save her, but we'll do it our way. And this time, there's no room for betrayal." The night was dark, with no moon, which helped their approach. The abandoned warehouse was in a forgotten industrial area, surrounded by wasteland and graffiti-covered walls. Andrew, with his arm bandaged in a makeshift manner, and wearing a vest borrowed from the police, stood next to Captain Harris, looking through night vision binoculars. "2 men at the front door, another 2 on the east side," Harris whispered. "If she's in there, she'll be on the ground floor." Behind them, Marion waited in an unmarked car, ready to provide backup. Emil, with his camera on his lap, was recording everything, but his face showed more fear than courage. "We're going to go in through the side without making any noise," said Harris. "Torres, you stay behind me." "No," Andrew replied firmly. "I'm going with her, no matter what happens." Harris looked at him for a second, assessing him. Then he just nodded. The group moved through the darkness, surrounding the warehouse. The smell of rust and old oil filled the air. With each step, Andrew's heart beat faster. He thought about what he would find. He wondered if he still had time. They managed to cut the side lock with a pair of pliers, the sound covered with a tarp so it wouldn't echo. They entered a narrow hallway, lit only by rays of light filtering through poorly hung spotlights. And then, in the silence, a click. "Who's there?" shouted a voice from the back. Without, there was no time to back away. A shot rang out, the dry sound echoing off the metal of the hold. Andrew felt the impact on his arm and fell to his knees, the heat of the blood running fast. "Torres!" Harris shouted, pulling him behind a pile of boxes. The exchange of gunfire began. The noise was deafening inside the enclosed space. The police advanced in formation, and Andrew, still in pain, pointed to a rusty door next to him. "Ty is in there, I heard her. 2 policemen broke down the front door." Others followed, and there, under the dim light of a hanging bulb, was Lucille, tied to a chair, her face beaten, but alive. Mom. Matthew, who had stayed in the car, couldn't take it anymore and ran to her, falling to his knees to cut the ropes. She hugged him with all her strength. The crying stuck in her throat. The police managed to arrest 3 of the men. 2 were handcuffed on the floor, cursing. Others managed to escape through the back. When Andrew, leaning on Harris, left the warehouse, he saw the empty parking lot. No sign of Colonel Ramirez was among those arrested. The night air hit Lucille's face, and she took a deep breath, as if only then was she sure she was still alive. Andrew, his arm throbbing, looked at her and Matthew, and felt that despite the blood, there was something greater in that moment, the hope that at least for now, they had won. The room was silent, except for the rhythmic sound of the heart monitor. and the soft rustling of the curtain in the wind coming through the half-open window. The soft light of dawn cast everything in a calmer, almost intimate tone. Andrew, his arm immobilized and still bandaged, was sitting next to the bed. He watched Lucille sleep, her face marked but serene. When she slowly opened her eyes, he approached her. "How do you feel?" he asked in a low, almost careful tone. She smiled a little, her voice still weak but alive, and that was a lot. They stood there for a few seconds looking at each other, until Lucille reached out her thin, trembling hand and held his tightly. "If it weren't for you, I wouldn't be here." Andrew tried to smile, but his eyes burned. His throat closed up, and he just squeezed her hand in response. There wasn't much to say. He knew that on other days she could have been in the oven of a crematorium, forgotten. Lucille took a deep breath, keeping her eyes on him. "Thank you. Really." He shook his head, but the gleam in his eyes gave him away. The door opened slowly, and Matthew walked in. He had dark circles under his eyes, as if he hadn't slept in days. He walked over to the bed without saying a word, and simply hugged his mother. It was a tight hug, as if he was afraid to let go and lose her again. Lucille took a moment, but then wrapped her arms around him with the same strength. "Son," she said for the first time, without hesitation, without avoiding the word. Matthew closed his eyes and cried against her shoulder, tears hot with relief and a love that no longer needed to be hidden. Lucille was also crying, stroking his hair as she had done when he was a child. "I thought I was going to lose you," he whispered. "I was never going to let that happen," she replied in a whisper. "Never." Andrew discreetly stepped aside, letting the two embrace in silence. From the hallway, he could still hear the mixed sounds of sniffles, and felt that after so much pain, it was the most beautiful sound he had heard in a long time. The sun shone timidly through the hospital room window, casting a soft golden glow over the room. Andrew was leaning back in his chair, his arms still immobilized, watching Lucille and Matthew talk quietly. There was a different atmosphere there, as if for the first time in a long time, danger had given them a respite. But inside, he knew he was still carrying the weight of everything that had happened. The sound of the gunshots, the heat of the blood running down his arm, the fear of not getting there in time. None of that would go away so soon. When the nurse came in to change the bandage, he got up slowly. His shoulder hurt, but that wasn't what bothered him. It was what came next. Later, back in the hallway, Captain Harris approached him. "So, Doctor, when are you going back to the academy?" Andrew looked at him, took a deep breath, and replied slowly, "No, I need to get away for a while." Harris frowned. "Are you going to quit?" "No." Andrew shook his head. "I just need to be here with them until everything settles down." The captain nodded silently. He knew that decision was not out of weakness, but out of priority. Back in the room, Andrew pulled up a chair and sat down next to Lucille's bed. Matthew was in the armchair, almost falling asleep. Lucille smiled when she saw him. "You shouldn't be resting. Can I rest here?" he replied, taking her hand. "I'm in no hurry." She looked at him for a moment, as if she wanted to say something, but settled for squeezing his hand back. Andrew realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about the next shift, the next report, the next autopsy. He was completely in the present, and that was somehow more difficult and more valuable than anything he had ever done before. Deep down, he knew that the world could wait, but Lucille and Matthew, after everything they had been through, could not. And he was not willing to lose them, not even for his own routine. The day was clear when the social worker arrived at the hospital with a black folder in her hands. She sat down in front of Lucille, Andrew, and Matthew, and placed some papers and a sealed envelope on the table. "Starting today, you have a new life," she said in a firm but gentle tone. "New documents, new address, all protected by the law. No one will be able to find you without authorization." Lucille held the paper with the new name. For a few seconds, She just looked at it without saying anything. It was strange to see something printed there that didn't bear the marks of fear. For the first time, that identity was official, not a hasty escape. Matthew, sitting to one side, looked restless. "And what about my family?" he asked hesitantly. "Did you ever find out who they were?" The social worker took a deep breath before answering. "Yes, we did. Your biological parents were police officers. A couple. They reported corruption within their own group. They refused to keep quiet and paid dearly for it." Matthew felt a chill. "They were murdered." "Yes," she said in a low voice, "but they managed to get you to safety first. That's how Lucille found you." Lucille reached out and touched his face with tears in her eyes. "I didn't know all the details. I just knew I had to protect you." Matthew took her hand, and in that gesture there was gratitude and an old pain that for the first time was beginning to find answers. A few days later, far from the city, Andrew's car was climbing a dirt road to a small village surrounded by mountains and green fields. Simple houses, children playing in the street, a bell ringing in the little church in the background. The new house was at the top of a hill, painted white with blue doors. Upon entering, Lucille took a deep breath, as if she wanted to keep the smell of peace inside her. Matthew opened the window and stared at the horizon with the wind ruffling his hair. "It's strange," he said, without taking his eyes off the landscape. "But I think for the first time, I feel like I can stay in one place without fear." Andrew put his hand on his shoulder. "So this is where the rest of your life begins." Lucille, leaning against the door, blushed. It wasn't a big smile, but it was full of something they had almost forgotten how it felt. Security. In that faraway town, with new names and a past that still hurt, they knew they couldn't erase what had happened, but they also knew that they finally had a home, and that was a start. The afternoon sun streamed through the living room window, illuminating the dust floating in the air. The town was quiet that day, with the distant sound of children playing in the street, and the church bell marking the hours. Andrew was sitting at the table, reading a local newspaper, when he heard slow footsteps behind him. Andrew. Matthew's voice had a different tone, almost like a ceremony. The doctor turned and saw the boy holding something wrapped in a blue cloth. Matthew walked over to him and placed the package on the table. "I want to give you something." Andrew raised an eyebrow in surprise. "What would that be?" Matthew carefully removed the cloth. Inside was a simple but well-made wooden frame. In the center, protected by glass, was the St. Jude Thaddeus pendant, the same one that had sparked so many questions. And next to it was a photograph of the three of them, Andrew, Lucille, and Matthew, smiling in front of their new house. Below the photo was a small plaque with engraved letters, "My dad, from the bottom of my heart." Andrew stood there silently for a few seconds, just looking. The weight of it wasn't metal or wood. It was history, pain, and love all rolled into one. He ran his finger across the glass, touching the image as if he could feel that moment again. Matthew's voice came out hoarse, broken. This means more than you can imagine." The boy smiled a little, but his eyes were moist. "I didn't have to be born to you to call you Dad. You earned that place with everything you've done for me and my mom." Andrew took a deep breath, trying to hold back the tears. "You don't know how much this honors me." Matthew took a step forward and hugged him tightly, without hurrying. Andrew responded by closing his eyes, feeling that gesture like a silent seal of everything they had lived through and overcome together. When they parted, the doctor looked again at the frame. The locket glowed softly in the evening light, as if somehow it were a blessing for this new chapter. "I'm going to put it on the living room wall," Andrew said with a peaceful smile, "so that every day we'll remember that it was worth it." Outside, the bell rang once more, and the town went on with its life. But inside that house, at that moment, there was a beautiful silence. The kind of silence that only exists when the heart is full. The crematorium was silent that morning, so different from the day he could never forget. Andrew walked slowly down the hallway, the the sound of his footsteps echoing on the cold floor. In one hand, he carried a white envelope containing his resignation letter. As he entered the main room, he smelled the same smell as always: hot metal, disinfectant, old coffee in the coffee pot. But now there was something different. The oven, turned off, seemed almost harmless. Almost. He approached slowly, remembering every detail of that morning clearly. The white sheet, Lucille's peaceful face, the color of her skin that didn't match her lifeless body, and the weak, almost non-existent pulse that changed everything. He stopped in front of the heavy metal door, running his hand over it, as if he could feel the vibration of that moment in the past. He closed his eyes for a moment. That day, he whispered to himself, God gave back more than a life. It wasn't just Lucille who had been saved. It was Matthew getting his mom back. It was Andrew himself, discovering that his job wasn't just numbers, reports, and protocols, but decisions that could change destinies. He opened his eyes, and for a few seconds just stared. There was no rush. Then he took a deep breath and left the envelope on the supervisor's desk. Inside was a simple letter. I am grateful for all these years, but it is time to follow another path. Before leaving, he looked back one last time. The oven was there silent, as if waiting for the next body. But for Andrew, that place would always hold the memory of the day when death had to wait, and life got another chance. As he walked through the door, the cool morning air enveloped him. He felt his chest lighten, as if he could finally put that chapter behind him. And deep down, he knew that wherever he was, he would never forget that sometimes a second of courage is all that separates the end from a new beginning. And if it were you, if you were there in front of someone who everyone said had no chance of recovery, but there was that tiny, almost invisible opportunity, would you have the courage to stop everything, face stares, rules, and even put your name at risk just to try to save a life? I want to know, in Andrew's place, or even in Matthew's, what would you do? Tell me here in the comments, because every answer brings a different way of looking at life. And don't forget to click the bell to receive our next videos. Stories that touch the heart and stay in the memory. Now, if you want to keep feeling, click on the video appearing on the screen. It's a moving story that has already made many people cry and think again about what really matters in life.